You can see I'm like not even done with the first tab. Although I think this is the tab with the most questions on it, at least. Um, uh, let's see. Is there any champ currently ignored by pros that you think would be strong? I can't really talk about that too much. I think there are some champions that probably should get played more. I think Tristana is a good example. Like, that champion's really good, actually. Like, actually quite good. Um, I think Tristana is probably uh, a good example of a champion that probably should see more pro play, but doesn't for whatever reason. And it's like, and maybe I don't see the pro player scrims and stuff like that. So it's like maybe she just maybe they try her out and she doesn't perform there, and that's like totally reasonable. If you don't have success with her in practice, I can understand why you wouldn't play her in pro games. But she's champion like by the metrics is like I kind of expect her to be like by the metrics and the shape of the champion, I kind of expect her to be a good pro champion at this like at the current on the current patch, and she's just not really played. Um, I used to play Teemo a lot in PC. His attack range is the same as Vayne and Lucian. Why on Wild Rift his range is smaller? Is a decision made by champion designers? Yes, that decision was made by the champion designer that did the Teemo rework in Wild Rift. I could not tell you exactly why they did that. It's probably because he has a dash, would be my guess, but I could not speak to that exactly why. And I also couldn't necessarily speak to like should it be that way. I'm not entirely sure. So I cannot tell you the actual answer to that question. Do you think Jungle Morgana came out too strong? No, we think it came out too weak. That's why we buffed it. We wouldn't have buffed it if we thought it was strong. Um, and as to whether it's strong in the current patch, we'll have to see. That's kind of developing. It's like for most players, it's definitely not actually that good. But it seems like it's at least playable for like for people who are willing to optimize the clear. So we'll see if that's too much, because it's definitely possible that it's too much. But we'll have to see how that plays out. Who are the writers to talk about around game design? You should ask at Draggles on Twitter who the correct people are, because I actually don't know all the people over there. Um, what will happen to champion who purposely abuse champion bugs? I don't know any of the punishment, like how any of the punishment system stuff works. That's around game stuff. But generally speaking, the policy here is like if you're clearly abusing something, we would punish you. Is generally how our policy sits. Okay. I know you've already talked about Jhin and his power imbalance, that he's strong mid game and really bad late game, but don't you think the majority of the player base cannot really enjoy that power curve? Majority of the player base isn't good at ending a game at mid game. Yes, so I've already talked about this a little bit. So I guess I kind of have a repeat question here, sort of. Yes, we do agree that most of the player base is not going to enjoy that power curve, which is why we would like to long term, or hopefully in the shorter term, we'll see, address that problem. Um, Why Fiora Q hit Vital through Jax Counter-Strike? Is it a bug or is it intended? On PC, Jax can block it, and it's an important part for this matchup. So this is a fundamental difference in some of the game rules in Wild Rift compared to PC. So in PC, a lot of the game rules get very complicated and have very specific exceptions and have very specific allowances for a variety of different mechanics. The Wild Rift mechanics are simpler in general. One of the simplifications of those game rules is that abilities that apply on hit effects do not necessarily instantly count as basic attacks. So in Wild Rift, this means that just because lunge applies on hit effects does not make it an attack. So this is intentional. It is not a bug that Counter-Strike does not dodge lunge in Wild Rift. Now, you can say that that's not the way it should be, and I think that's a fair criticism, but the truth is that the system is simpler because of this rule. And that is like, this isn't something that the original champ designer did, and they're like, haha, I think Fiora should be OP or anything like that. It's like they made this decision because this is just consistent with the rules that Wild Rift has, right? Like, and you can argue with the rules, and that's totally fair. That like you could say the rules are like the rules shouldn't be that way, and the rules you should just add this extra small bit of complexity to the rules. And I think that's fair, and like that's probably a conversation we could have. But it's like the reality here is like that's the way the rules work, and so this isn't a bug. That's just the way that the rules are. Um, so that's kind of how it is. I don't really know what else to tell people about that one. Has anything about Set's release seriously surprised you? Not really too much. He's looking like he's on the stronger side, but nothing really too surprising. Um, do you think there's way too less magic resist tank items? I think there probably could be one more, but I think the bigger problem is that and this is something that I think PC had problems with and still has some problems with now, but they've sort of solved it a little bit with the changes they've made to Force of Nature. I think the bigger problem is that the magic resistance tank items are too narrow. So it's not necessarily that there's too few of them. It's that for how many they are or how many of them there are, they're too narrow. Like most champions are only really happy with like one of the magic resist items or sometimes zero depending on the situation. So that's kind of the issue is that like it's not that there's too few of them, it's that if we want to have this number, they should be slightly more generic so that you're a little bit happier with the different items that you pick. Um, do you know if there's been an update to minion AI speed of how they respond slash Diego slash aggro? That is very unlikely. It's not likely we're going to touch anything with minion AI anytime soon. So uh, let's see. Since you worked with August on Kale, can you share more about bringing back her true damage in Wild Rift? Would it be up for removal if it skews her laning like it did in PC? Um, I wasn't the one doing the champs work, so I'm not on the champs team to be clear. So I didn't decide any of Kale's mechanics. I did do the balancing for Kale, which by the way is why she's overpowered because I tried to match her power curve better. I think when the champ designers handed Kale off to me in Wild Rift, I actually buffed her. I suspect when she was handed off to me that she was probably just strong, maybe a little overpowered, but not nearly as strong as she shipped. I ended up buffing her because I kept getting a lot of feedback from people on that worked on Wild Rift internally, from the game analysis team, that hey, Kale doesn't feel like she scales right. Her auto attacks don't feel good, and so I did stuff like I increased her AS per level. I made her passive AS per stack scale with your Transcendence rank. I gave her a lot of attack speed because one of the things I noticed is that in PC, you buy Zerker Greaves and you take Legend Alacrity in every single game as Kale. You get a ton of attack speed for very low opportunity cost. And you can't do those things in Wild Rift. And so to make her attacks feel better, I gave her more attack speed. And that is what ended up making her, in my opinion, I think that's what ended up making her overpowered, is that I did not properly compensation nerf her for those things. Um, but one thing I am very happy with is that we've been able to preserve the extra attack speed on her passive, which I actually think is important to making her feel good, like to make her auto attacks feel good in the late game. And so I kind of sacrificed, we didn't have a lot of time to balance Kale, so I kind of sacrificed some of my balancing time in return for making the champion feel better. And I think long term that will be worth it. But one of the things we've changed is that we are going to spend more, like we're going to have more time to balance champions in the future so that situations like that don't occur again, hopefully. Um, but that's like kind of the long form answer is uh, I didn't do the mechanics for Kale, so I can't necessarily tell you like, hey, what do we think the long term implications of this are? I will need to spend some more time on that. We can't E Akali on or E on Akali smoke, and Fura can't Q on turret as PC version. Yes, the mechanics in general in Wild Rift are simpler. It's also true that Garen doesn't get armor and MR from killing minions, and he just gets more armor and MR per level. Mechanics are generally going to be simpler. That's just a decision that was made in Wild Rift's design. That champion kits would overall have fewer mechanics and be slightly simpler. In some cases, there might be room for us to add stuff like that, but generally we'd only do that if we think it's like going to be very beneficial for the game. Akali is already insanely skill skewed. We don't really think it's adding a mechanic to allow her to attach to the shroud is like going to be a great win for us, basically. Why you skip my question? Sorry, I'm having a really hard time keeping up with the chat. Also, I'm trying to get through these questions also. So sorry if I ignore your question. Please just ask it again, unless I tell you I can't answer it. I can't tell you anything about console release, by the way. I literally don't know anything about it. And if I did, I couldn't tell you anyway. So, okay. Let's. Okay, some of these questions I'm going to talk about in these questions I have prepared. So let me just get through some of these questions. I'm going to ignore chat for a little bit and get through some of these questions, hopefully. Okay, hey, I wanted to ask, is there any plan on adjusting the current Bruiser slash Juggernaut itemization? Currently in both competitive games as well as highly reload games, I see most people just buying Black Cleavers regardless of game state on basically every champion that benefits from AD ability haste and HP. And it is extremely rare to ever see a 3-item build on Trinity or Cleaver users without a Sterak's gauge being included. It feels almost mandatory to have these items on every melee non-assassin champion. Yeah, I think there's some good problem statements here, like Black Cleaver being prioritized over Triforce. I think the bigger problem with this one is, hey, how do we make it to how can we pay off very skilled players to build Triforce? Because I would generally expect for really skilled players, the cheaper item with more defenses on it, because Cleaver has more health. Yes, I expect that it's probably true that the more skilled players will generally prefer the cheaper item that spikes them faster, that gives them more defensive stats. That's fair. I do think it might be skewed a little bit far into Black Cleaver's favor at this point. I kind of agree with the problem statement here. I don't think it's like an extreme like, wow, we should go nerf Black Cleaver or anything like, immediately type of deal. But I do kind of agree. I think the balance is skewed a little bit. I also think it's probably fair to say like, hey, should this only be like a problem between a problem space of like deciding between Cleaver and Triforce? Because that's not a great decision point for most champions, to be honest with you. So it's possible there needs to be another item or that we need to change the decision point here for this system. Uh, I think that's like this is like a reasonable problem statement, but I don't have like an immediate like this is clearly what we should do for the solution statement here, right? Like that's how I would say it. Um, as far as the 3 item build for bruisers that always have Sterak's, yes, I think that's definitely true. I think long term, our ideal here, like to be clear, it's not actually a problem if there's like a good item for a class that you really feel pressured to include in your 3 item build, right? Like an example of this being fine for a class is like Infinity Edge for 80 carries, right? It's like if you build almost any 80 carry build, and I'm not talking about like caster builds like the Armor Pen Varus build or anything like that. I'm talking about like actual like auto attacking DPS 80 carry builds. If you do a 3 item 80 carry build and you don't have IE in it, you're probably doing something wrong, right? Like you've probably gone wrong somewhere. I don't necessarily think that's a problem. What I will say is I do think it would be good for us to provide choice there, right? Like an example of how PC has done this is they've added Rageblade and IE into the game, right? And those items have no synergy, right? They're anti-synergistic because they don't work with each other at all. And that's kind of a decision point, right? It's like if you want big crits, big DPS, you go IE. If you have a bunch of on-hit effects and you want consistency, you probably take the Rageblade, right? And there are some champions that can buy one or the other, though most champions prefer one or the other, right? It's like I think long term, that's probably what we'd like to do with Sterax is like an example of what this might look like. And I'm not saying we're doing this or that we'll ever do this necessarily, but it's just an example of what this might look like. Um, we could make one version of Sterax where it's a very powerful shield that lasts a smaller amount of time. Um, and so, hey, this is the version of Sterax that's really good against burst, right? It's like it's not that good against 80 carries, but if you're fighting a lot of mages or whatever, and obviously Maw Malmortius is supposed to fill this niche, but it just doesn't. Maw is just not going to do it, right? We need a different item for this probably, or a different version of Maw. Um, but like, yes, there could be a version of Sterax where it's like a very short duration shield, but it's really powerful, right? There could also be a version of Sterax where uh, the shield is really low cooldown, but it's not as powerful, right? It's like maybe it's like an 8-second cooldown, but the shield shields like a third as much as the current Sterax shield, right? Where it's like, hey, if you survive to another shield, this is really good, but it's not as good at anti-burst, right? It's like that's the kind of thing I'm talking about here, where it's like I think it would be good for us to have like two anti-synergistic options to select here. It's not necessarily a bad thing if classes have items that they feel pressured to buy, though, right? Like the problem statement of like this is a team fight bruiser item that everyone wants. It's like that's not really a problem statement in and of itself. I do agree though that it's like it would be nice if we could kind of split that into 2 items where you had to make a meaningful choice between them. Hold on. Okay. Whew. Um, any chance you're going to put teleport from boot enchant to spell so top laners can gank bot lane more early? It's very unlikely. I think we're more likely to remove teleport than we are to add it as a summoner spell. Not saying we'll never ever do it, but I think it's unlikely. I'll just tell you straight up, we don't love like the current team is really not like in love with so like teleport in general, and definitely not in love with the idea of making it a summoner spell. Um, okay. Uh, why is Ash Q still lands even when blinded by Teemo Q? Encountered this in Earth, but it's not the same with Jinx Q or Xayah W. I'm actually not sure. That sounds like a bug. I will hold on. Let me make a note of that. I will go check that out on Monday. Let me write that down. Teemo blind on Ash Q. All right, I will check that out on Monday, but not right now because I'm not working. I'm streaming, which is not work. I'm not being paid for this, by the way. I just do this on my own time. I guess I'm technically being paid by Twitch. I think I've made like 16 cents from streaming, something like that. I'm rich, actually. I'm like huge stacks coming in, absolutely massive. Um, anyway, uh, so okay. There are no 80 plus armor items except GA. Are there plans to add another? Not right now. It's a space that we could work on. At some point, I think. Would you be okay with your VOD turned into an opinion piece on YouTube? I would prefer people don't like post it as their own content. I think if you're like talking through my answers and maybe like putting your own opinion and doing stuff like that's like cool to me if you want to like respond and like talk through and like maybe have like something of a conversation and I can go watch that later and like get some interesting thoughts. It's like to me it's less cool. Like I saw someone else I saw this was posted on Reddit. It was like someone literally just posted like like a 20-minute section of clips from my VOD. I was like, this does not like this is really not something I like just other people just like taking the stuff that I've made and just like presenting it as their content is like I don't know. I'm not really a big fan for a bunch of reasons, but I'm not really going to get into it. No question. Just wanted to say it's awesome that you do this, and I love you guys. Thank you so much. It's awesome to hear stuff like that. Thank you for doing this on your own time. Absolutely. Thanks for your contribution. Yeah. Yeah. I'm really glad people are super appreciative. I will say, I I have been really happy with like people have been super positive on my stream, and it's been super awesome to see that. I have actually been like really impressed, which I love. Just awesome. Any chance you bring PC boots like Berserker's Greaves to Wild Rift? It is very unlikely we ever do Berserker's Greaves because Berserker Greaves were intentionally excluded from the choice structure of Wild Rift because they rob the choice structure for 80 carries and anyone that scales with attack speed. So basically, the idea here is that boots are supposed to be a like defensive slash flex slot. Though in my opinion, I think that CDR boots should not have been included. Like I think that was a poor decision. Um, because I think that also robs the choice structure for a lot of champions. Basically, the boots choice is way less interesting for 80 carries or champions like Yasuo if the AS boots exist because you just always have to buy them. We just have to tune the champions around always buying them, so it's kind of tough. If Q goes through Jack's Counter Strike, is it Nintendo or just a bug? I actually already answered that. That was over here. So you will have to watch the VOD. I'm going to make you watch the VOD if you want to find out the answer to that question. I already answered it. What are your thoughts about tank situation? Why is Barry Lane so poor at tanks? Last tank I saw released is Malphite and maybe Mundo. I see Mundo more like a Juggernaut than a tank. By the way, I'm glad you're going to add Shen. I hope we'll come more Baron Lane tanks in this Houston. We got 1 year without them. It's definitely a space that like so if you're familiar with Rogue Fool, one of the other designers who used to be on the team that I'm on, he's now a champ designer. That's something that he's definitely been talking about is like, hey, look, there's just not that many Baron Lane tanks that we have in the game. Like we should add more champ like role diversity and like role health is something he's been really focused on. I can't tell you that he's like working on 6 of them right now or anything like that. I actually don't even know what champions he's working on. But that's something that he's been talking about a lot, and that's like more in terms of upcoming content, like in terms of champions. That's more something that he has been working on. It's like something that diversity is something he's definitely been a big proponent of, and I'm really like I'm happy to support him as much as I can in terms of like yes, I agree we should get more role diversity and like get more like tanks that can go into the Baron lane and stuff like that. As far as tank situation overall, again, I kind of agree with the line of logic here of like I don't think it's necessarily a problem of the items or anything like that are bad for Baron lane tanks. It's more just that we only really have Malphite and like kind of Gragas as champions that could reasonably lane and are like actual full tank champions that go in Baron lane. So, um, speaking of items, what are your thoughts on Stormrazor? I don't know if it's the stats of the slow, not too effective. But I think it's energized item performing worse right now. I agree. Stormrazor is not an ideal spot. I don't necessarily have an immediate suggestion of, um, like, oh, this is exactly the thing that we should do to Stormrazor. But I do agree, like long term, I think Stormrazor is not in a great spot. No champion really loves Stormrazor that much. Like, there's a few builds that include it, but they're usually like niche off builds that are like situationally good. And I think it would be better if we could make it like a part of a mainline build or something that's like a little bit more interesting for people to pick up. So yeah, I don't have like a immediate solution of like we should do X, Y, or Z, but I kind of agree with the problem statement of like Stormrazor is not great. Shen is a tank. Yes, Shen is a tank. Shen is kind of like I will tell you, Shen is not a traditional tank in the sense that the way he lanes is actually more like a bruiser like before he gets his ultimate than a tank really. Like he kind of like plays lane like a fighter, like where he has these like powerful, like threatening, like medium length trades. But he definitely has a lot of attributes of a tank, and in particular in the late game, he definitely is a tank, right? It's like you just build those. Um, I don't want to come off as rude, but out of the recent champs, Kale Morgana, Set, Yumi, Shen, Karma is a long stream of Baron plus support. Uh, I'm sure that the champs team is aware that like of those things that like they have a lot of things to consider when they're doing champ releases. Some of them are, the role distribution, and I'm sure that they're aware that like yes, this is probably not an ideal string of champions. I agree. It's like yeah, yes, there's a lot of champions for Baron and support. Um, but they also have a lot of other considerations as to like what champions they're going to add. Um, have you considered separating Mortal Reminder to two items, Grievous and Percent Armor Pen? Yes, we have considered that. We're not going to do it for now, but it's something that we've talked about. We might do it in the long term if we ever want to do another 80 carry items, um, you know, reshape. But it's not something that we decided to do last time. I couldn't tell you exactly why they did or did not do that, but I can tell you it's something that they were talking about when they were doing the last 80 carry items update, where they added stuff like Charge Blade and all that stuff. I could not tell you exactly what the decision process was for like why they decided Mortal should be the armor pen and the Grievous item at the same time. I would guess probably it's because they were adding Cyrilda's Grudge, which is an armor pen item that doesn't have Grievous on it, so there is that as an option if you want it. But I could not tell you exactly why. Okay, I've answered a lot of chat questions. Let's get back to the what's it called? Um, Hello, which classes do you think have the worst items right now? So there's two ways I could take this. I sent a question back to this person on Twitter, but they didn't answer. This is a Twitter DM. There's two ways I could take this. There's like worst items in terms of design or worst items in terms of power. Power is a really difficult question for me to answer, and I'm not actually sure what the question like what like that would be like something that would be a really difficult answer, and I don't think could come up with a good answer to be perfectly honest with you. So I'll take it from like the design perspective of like which items do I think are the worst designs, and I think the answer to that one is like pretty easy for me. Is like I think the AD assassin items are the worst, which isn't necessarily like an indictment of the people who made the AD assassin items originally. Like it's not at all. It's more a factor of like the AD assassin items are the ones that have gone the longest in Wild Rift without getting a serious long hard look taken at them by the balance designers, which I think just reflects like. Yeah, the more like the longer the game goes, the more information we have and the better targeted changes we can make to the items. That's why like I think the 80 carry item system, which got a pretty significant reshape in mid 2021, is like yeah, that item system is better than most of the other ones, right? Like I think the designs are generally better because the designers who made those were working with a lot more information and a lot better information than the people who made all the other items. So again, the 80 assassin items I think overall, with the exception of Edge of Night, which I think is a spectacular item and a really good add to the game. um Obviously that's a more recent item. I think the 80 assassin items are the most lacking in terms of design value. Okay. Um, do you think Riot should consider to inform players about the difference between tanks, juggernauts, bruisers? Like people think Garen is a tank when he's clearly a juggernaut. I don't know if we should really spend a lot of time working on that type of stuff for players. Like players, we can let players figure that stuff out on their own, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. Um, there is probably value in like informing players that Garen has a lot of AD ratios now. Like even in comparison to when Wild Rift came out, like obviously his ult has like an AD ratio, and like in general his damage has been shifted out of base damage and into ratios, like because he was building full tank and that was too good. And I think that's fair. I wish we had better signaling for stuff like that, but I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with players perceiving Garen as a tank and being able to experiment with builds on their own and find out that yeah, it's better to build some AD. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, Okay. What information do you have on people using the two new support items? We have all the information we normally have. We have lots of information, though they're not built as often as we'd like. We definitely should get them into rec builds, which is something we're planning on doing at some point, so that we can get better information from players who don't look at the shop and only build rec items, which is a surprisingly large number of players, by the way. So we definitely need to get them in rec builds for sure, but nothing really I can say about that. Are you thinking to rework Gargoyle Stoneplate like PC version? I personally would like to do that, but it's just not a priority for us because the current version of Gargoyle Stoneplate works. It's not ideal. Like I'm not sure exactly why they made the original version of Gargoyle Stoneplate because I think that item clearly has some like very significant satisfaction issues, but it's not like a huge problem. So I think we'll do it eventually, or do something eventually to like change Gargoyle Stoneplate to something else. Might not be exactly the PC version, but I think we'll eventually change Gargoyle Stoneplate because I think the current version is like, at least I personally am not super happy with it. I think the rest of my team is like a little bit happier with it, but they're probably not in love with it. So yeah, basically that's what I'd put on that. Okay, why do items have less stats in Wild Rift than PC? I'm gonna answer this question from the sheet and stop paying attention to chat for now. Okay, so I've talked about this a little bit before. And so there's some parts of this that I'm not going to get super in depth on, where if you really want to know the answer to this question, you can look at some of my previous VODs, especially the last one where I did the last patch review for 3.0. Um, but Basically, there is a different balance of power between champion stats, like champion level ups, like rank ups and stuff like that, and items and runes. More of the power in Wild Rift comes on the champion naturally, like you just get it for leveling up, than you get from items and you get from runes. There's a bunch of reasons for this, right? One of the big things is that this allows us to give the player more gold to finish more items so that we can have a higher number of average finished items in Wild Rift than we do in PC, right? You might notice that if you've played both Wild Rift and PC, you might notice like, hey, it's actually not that weird to have to get for a few people to be full build in a Wild Rift game. That's not crazy. In PC, that's rare, right? Like quite rare. In PC, many games end before most people finish their third item, and most games end before people finish their fourth item, right? Um, there's some pretty significant differences between the two games in terms of power distribution in the item system and in champion kits, and even in runes. Runes are also less powerful in Wild Rift. And that is an intentional design choice. You might notice that other mobile MOBA games also do this. Partially, it's because of pacing reasons. These games need to be faster pace because they're mobile games. And uh, there's a lot of stuff going into that I don't want to get into because it's a really complicated question to answer. But one of them is that it allows the Wild Rift game pacing to simulate a lot of the things that PC does with items without having to force the player to use this very small shop window and do a lot of selection and use the UI. It's like we know the shop is not as interesting or good as in PC, right? It's like that's just a reality of the platform, right? It's like the shop is just not as good. Okay, so we can make the shop a little bit less important, and that's just probably good for the system. We want to still have the shop, and we want the shop to still be important, just a little bit less important than it is in PC. And that's kind of why the item system has less power in it, and consequentially has less stats. Um, Again, if you're looking for a more in-depth answer, I've talked about this quite a bit before in some of my previous streams. So um, that's kind of like there's a bunch of reasons, and I have not probably I could probably spend like I don't know like half an hour talking about that topic by itself, but I'm not going to because that would be a crazy amount of time investment. Have you guys ever thought about adding something like Elixir? We have spent a little bit of time talking about it, but I think most people are just not fans. Like we don't kind of going back to like we know the shop is not as interesting of a system to interact with. It's like we don't really want to add something to force players to interact with the shop even more, especially something that's like a high level optimization that you might want to buy middle of the game type of stuff. Like we don't have a great way to like represent the elixir to players, and so even if we wanted it, like which by the way, I think many PC designers are not happy with elixirs in the game. By the way, like they're not. I would personally not consider them to be like a great design. The elixir system, it's like this whole idea of temporary power is like very agency up for high, like extremely highly optimized players, but it's like most players just won't recognize the power very well. So it's kind of this like weird thing where it's like very high MMR skewed power that you have to tune certain champions around, and like I don't know. It's not a great system. Um, and it's probably a worse system in Wild Rift comparatively to PC. So I think it's unlikely that we ever add elixirs. Patch 3.1 will be the biggest this year. I don't know if that's true. Patch 3.1 will certainly be bigger than 3.0. I have some questions about that in the future, but I can't necessarily tell you how big the patch will be, and I can't even necessarily be sure how big the patch will be because sometimes stuff gets moved in or out of a patch last minute, so I can't necessarily guarantee I know how big patch 3.1 will be. Um, which champions other than Jhin and Teemo needs a power curve change? Off the top of my head, I think Evelynn could use one. There's probably a few other champions. Probably Jace could use one as well. Um, there's probably other champions, but I off the top of my head, that one's a little tough. Will mythic items like Gore Drinker and Divine Sunder come to Wild Rift? It is possible that some of the mythic items from PC will come to Wild Rift at some point. If they do come, it is very unlikely that we will add the mythic item system, and so they will probably be weaker or slightly different versions that exist in the game. But I think Gore Drinker in particular is probably unlikely because it's a lot of that item is about the active. Um, but oh, what did I say? Did I say something that was coming? But if I said something was coming, I did not mean to say that. So don't take that as a leak. But Gore Drinker and Divine Sunder are like possibilities. I think Divine Sunder is probably more likely. But hopefully I didn't. Hopefully I didn't say something was definitely coming when that's not true. Oh, you said about mythic items? Yeah. So mythic items probably will not come. Like mythic item system is very unlikely to get added to Wild Rift. Certain mythic items are more likely to be added, and possible to be added. Will there be an honor system in Wild Rift? Don't know. Doesn't have to do with support, so don't care. Fair enough. Did anyone ask about Seed Jar? Any stats about how often it is used? I think someone did ask about Seed Jar, but I had to skip over the question because I was trying to get through some other questions at the time. It's not purchased as often as we would like. I think we're somewhat happy. Like we're seeing like kind of promising data for Mega Drive, and we're